Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion topic. In this one I want to talk about my own sort of history with the fandom. I suppose more specifically focused in on Avatar The Last Airbender Online.com. As well as just a general discussion, I suppose, on sort of fan sites and the sort of shift in fandom, I suppose, away from specific fan sites and forums to more social media. Because I was asked like a question, can you talk about sort of the history of Avatar Spirit, what happened? And my answer, of course, was just like, I know about Avatar Spirit, but it's never really been a forum that I've been involved in that much. I believe I have an account, as I'll discuss, but I barely used it. So it's not a place that like necessarily is a huge part of my own fandom, but what is Avatar The Last Airbender Online, which is kind of an interesting one in that if you've only sort of started following my channel in the last few years, you'll probably be wondering like, wait, okay, you've mentioned that a few times, but what is Avatar The Last Airbender Online.com? Because you'll probably have noticed like the site kind of is up sometimes, is not up sometimes. About the only time I really mention it kind of more recently is on the podcast, because it's still technically the podcast for that website, because that's where it started, that's where most of it is hosted, and while it's primarily a YouTube podcast now, I still want to acknowledge that. But yeah, it's to the point where I think a lot of people are kind of like, oh yeah, it's your website, isn't it? But it's like, no, it's not, because the site existed for quite a while before I joined. It was during, I suppose, the Last Airbender movie sort of period of the fandom. It was primarily, I think, just a news site. It didn't have a forum at that point, and Jordan was the one primarily kind of doing that. But when Korra was announced, he did launch a forum, a whole community thing, on the site. And that was sort of in or around when I got involved in things. Now, this is where I suppose I have to address my own history in the fan site. I've discussed this before, but it's been a while. I think the main thing is, fandom is online primarily. My family only got the internet in like 2007. So in terms of Avatar timeline, this is like post book 2. So book 1 and 2 had aired, and I'd watched them on TV. I was a big fan, but I wasn't online, so I wasn't really involved in the fandom. It was just a show that I really, really liked. But when we finally got the internet, it obviously gave me access to, watch the show as much as I wanted to, as well as properly join the online fandom for the first time. Now, initially this was just in terms of like, websites that would host the episodes to watch, and they have a little chat box, and I was there. Because of course, a big part of the Avatar time period of the fandom was just the news about when is book 3 going to air. What's the news? If you look at the release dates of the episodes, it had a very scattered release schedule. It would release an episode here or there, there'd be a pause, break here or there, there's a pretty big gap in the middle of the season, and then, building towards the finale. So there was a lot of like time for kind of speculation, and in those sort of chat boxes and those type of websites was where a lot of I suppose my early sort of fandom stuff happened, in terms of trying to find news about when the new episodes are airing. And of course, back then, a lot of the times like an episode would air in like, in France first or something like that. There's a few, I think, instances of stuff like that where there'd kind of more or less sort of be leaks where this place would get the episode first, then this place, and America would surprisingly be like almost kind of the last place to get it, and it was kind of a confusing time. I believe in around this time I did actually have an account on Avatar Spirit, but like I said, I didn't end up using it that much. It was pretty clear that was the main Avatar fan site, of course. Very, very popular. That's why it has so many like interviews from that sort of time period with the creators and so on. It is and will always be sort of like the Avatar fan site. It just, I suppose, didn't really kind of suit me, and I never really sort of stuck around there that much. And that kind of pretty much gets us through most of Avatar. Like, I'll always remember, the speculation and hype around, when's the new episode going to air, and then especially the finale, just waiting for those episodes to be uploaded online, because of course, being from Ireland, they weren't going to air here on TV at the same time as they were in America. So it's like waiting for the Americans to post it online, and up at like past midnight waiting for the episodes. Back when, of course, people uploaded actual TV shows to YouTube, and they'd upload it in like 5 or 6 parts, each is like 7 minutes. Interesting time for the history of things there. But that was sort of my experience. That's kind of how I watched the finale for the first time, is in these sort of scattered parts on YouTube, uploaded like a few hours after the initial airing. Just such an exciting time, of course. But once the show came to an end, it was kind of weird, because there wasn't really a lot of information about, like, okay, what's happening. Like, we didn't have really comics back then necessarily. The merchandise had already kind of pretty much stopped as of like early book 2, and so it just sort of faded away. I got interested in other things, of course, until the Last Airbender movie news started to come out, which was when sort of stuff built up again. At this time, I was a lot more familiar with the internet, and I believe the main sort of forums I was on at the time were a Nintendo forum. I think it was official Nintendo magazine forum, and also the Transformers forum, TFW 2005. And this is sort of where Avatar: The Last Airbender Online comes in, but it's still a little bit off. When the Last Airbender movie came out, I don't remember if I managed to find the details for my account for Avatar Spirit, or if I made a new one. But either way, I was on Avatar Spirit for a little bit during the sort of movie time period after it released. But again, well, not the best place. Now, admittedly, that was partly due to the fact that I'm not someone who absolutely like hates the movie or and like rips it apart. So that never tends to go down particularly well in the fandom. And I wouldn't say it was like a terrible experience. But it wasn't exactly the most sort of welcoming and stuff like that. A lot of people can't really discuss the movie without getting pretty emotional about it, which is kind of unfortunate, but it's understandable. Either way, it wasn't my thing. I'm not trying to say that the community of Avatar Spirit was terrible. Just certain topics like that don't tend to be able to be discussed particularly properly. So again, my second attempt at Avatar Spirit didn't really work out that well. But like I said, having a much better time on the Nintendo forum and the Transformers forum. And obviously we're in around like 2010, 2011 at this point. And what happened was that it was obviously, I suppose, mid to late 2011 was when we started to hear news about there potentially is another series on the horizon, and then Korra properly got like announced in or around that time. And there was a thread on TFW 2005. It was just the general like Avatar and then Avatar and Korra thread. And I basically ended up taking the position in that thread of the main guy finding news, and almost like the main guy discussing the news as well in that thread. And I was then alerted by one of the members, who was one of the other main persons discussing it with me, that, there's this new Avatar forum that's, I think it was a private message, that there's this new Avatar forum that's like just launched. I know you've talked about how you didn't have a great experience on some of the other Avatar fan sites, but here's a new one, and they want moderators. Like, why not apply? And he said like he'd already applied, and I was kind of like, my initial reaction was just kind of like, no, because it'll probably go a very similar way to some of the other ones that I've been a part of. I'm kind of fine just in this thread on this Transformers site. That seems a little bit better to me. But I did end up actually taking a look at the site, and I kind of realized like, it's actually nicely designed, and the forums seem kind of like new and different compared to like most message boards at the time. So I'm kind of like, okay, I guess I'll go for this. Maybe being involved in this community right at the start can help it go in an interesting direction. And so I applied to be a moderator there. after the recommendation from someone else from the Transformers side. And basically at this time, I think there was like, I think it was well under 50 members on the site at this point. Like the forums had really just launched in response basically to, there is news of a new series coming, hype, hype, hype. And so a lot of the initial members who joined and applied were moderators. So I believe by the time I became a moderator on the site, it was a case where there was, I think, in or around like 15 moderators or so. And most of the people signed up were moderators. So the sort of selection process was kind of like random, and it was always going to be that way when you have people applying to just be a moderator on a site and so on. It's always hard to judge, you know, who would make a good moderator, who wouldn't. What was interesting though is that like when I joined, there was so many moderators already. It was kind of like, okay, that's maybe a little bit too many. We'll look into adding you later, but one thing we're working on right now is that we want to have episode recaps, like written recaps of the episodes on the site as one of the main kind of information pages. The plan is that all of the moderators are going to write like 2-3 episode recaps each. And then all together it'll be a full Avatar series recap, every single episode covered. Here is the 2 or 3 you should write. And so I actually wrote the first ones because no one had actually done any at that point, because I think they'd just come up with the plan. So I think within a few hours I wrote the recaps for the first few. And then Jordan just said, okay, why not do a few more? And eventually, basically, no one else was submitting anything, so I ended up doing all of them, all 61 recaps. And so that was technically my first sort of post on the site. I didn't have access to the sort of news, putting up a post aspect of the site. It was just, submitting the text, and I think Jordan put the post together. But that was my first, involvement in the sort of news editing sense on the site, and that was also basically what, earned me the moderator sort of position. And I think very quickly after that I was made a moderator. And this sort of gets into the way that stuff happened on Avatar The Last Airbender Online, is that like the community was just really great, and it was cool that like so many people were moderators, and it was so kind of relaxed, and it was really just a community. Like over the entire run of the forums of Avatar The Last Airbender Online, we never really had any problems. There was very few situations where any of the moderators, including myself, ever really had to step in and, stop something from happening. Most of the moderation stuff was pretty much the stuff you usually have on forums, which is like duplicate threads, spam users, and that sort of stuff. Just deleting content that is just basically getting in the way. Very few of it is just like needing to sort of like give people warnings or bans. That never really happened on the site. So it was kind of low-key in that over the course of the run, most of the moderation on the site was sort of just keeping the different forum sections organized. It was putting up a pinned thread for the new episode discussion. If a new comic was announced, putting up a pinned thread to discuss that comic. That sort of stuff. It was really not the sort of punishment side of things like at all. And because of that, I was able to actually do quite a lot of it kind of on myself, because I had the time at that point to put into putting a lot of effort into the site. And so like I didn't just do the sort of moderation stuff. Like I was actively posting on most of the threads and stuff like that. Because I think initially the idea for most of the moderators was that, okay, there's probably not going to be a lot of like moderation work to do, so do your job as sort of a community leader basically by just posting and setting a good example to other people who aren't going to be moderators on sort of how to post. And in that sense, everyone, I think it all worked well, and a lot of the really early members of the site sort of did stick around for most of the run of the site, which was kind of cool to see. Well, what ended up happening is that the way once we were properly into things and like Korra had like come out and stuff like that, it was pretty clear that like we have kind of like too many moderators. Like there's not enough to really do, And a lot of people are moderators, and like it doesn't really mean anything because they're basically just a normal community member, but they happen to have the moderator title. And so there was stuff like that where like certain moderators would go inactive for a certain amount of time, so you had to remove them as a moderator. And then, do we need to get new moderators? And so like as you'd expect, it typically is who is an active poster, who is a good who has sort of a good influence in a way on the community, has a good sense of posting and so on. And so that's typically the way it ended up going with regards to the moderators. It was in or around this time that I became the super moderator, I think is the technical term for the title. And so I was the sort of like head moderator at that point. And that was the case just because I ended up being the one who sort of made a lot of the decisions about like how the forum should be organized in the first place, in terms of like Jordan asking like, okay, these are the initial forum sections that we have, what other ones do we need? I think most of the suggestions for the sections were my ideas. And like it was obviously like from a community sense, I launched some of the other stuff that was kind of popular on the site, a lot of the big kind of community things, which was the Avatar trivia, which I think a lot of the members remember really fondly. I did a lot of the, I think I did a lot of the initial trivia questions stuff, but then I did step back and participated as just someone answering the questions as well. And that was a popular thing. I think it started off as a weekly thing, and it was weekly for quite a while. And we just switched who did the questions, and we kept track of it and all the results. I think as time went on, it became more of a like 2 weekly thing, then monthly thing, and then it was much less regular after that. And I think it was like threads like that were super popular at the start that really gave us the hint as Korra came to an end, and the news in the aftermath of the show wasn't like huge, and the fandom was sort of moving away. That stuff like that was what really gave the sense of like, yeah, the forum isn't like doing as well anymore. Like we had stuff like our fan art contest, we had a fan art section that was, you know, not like hugely used, but there was some people who really liked it because, you know, because it wasn't like the fan art section of the main site, it was this other site that was happening at the time. I think some fan artists liked that, you know, if they become sort of the main fan artist on this site, their post will get a few more views. So there was always like that sense of things as well as the fact that the community was like that we had was really supportive also. But the main thing that I think I launched there was that this is obviously where the podcast came from. I had tried to launch the podcast much earlier than it actually did, like quite a few months beforehand. Very shortly after joining the site, it was one of my big things that I wanted to do. And I realized in reflection that that initial attempt wouldn't have worked from a, I think, technology point of view. I think the recording software that I had just wouldn't have worked. I think it didn't record both sides of the call. And at that time, I don't think I had the technical expertise to make it happen. So it actually was to our benefit that didn't end up working then. And then much closer to Korra, my second attempt at the podcast actually did work. And obviously, it was pretty much a community thing to a degree. If I remember correctly, like we kind of ran it through the community, like, okay, what should be the name of the site? And we had a few ideas, some of the kind of typical ones. I think some of the names that we came up with at the time are now the names of actual podcasts. I don't know how active they are anymore, but we ended up going with ATLAOnline podcast because we a lot of them were very in-jokey, and it felt like, is this going to be popular if we're known as like the one line of dialogue from Avatar podcast, when should we not be more general? Like, we want to emphasize that this is sort of this kind of community podcast almost, that it's based off this forum, which has a really good kind of back and forth dynamic with everyone. So yeah, ATLAOnline podcast, kind of named after the site. That seemed like the way to go. And as you'd expect, it was pretty much like, okay, I'm going to be the host, of course, because I'm coming up with the idea. I'm going to be doing most of the work. I'm the news editor, so I'll be posting it and stuff like that. And obviously, I believe I'd ran it through with Jordan of like, okay, if we launch a podcast, can you figure out the sort of technical side of hosting the podcast? And it's like, yep, that's fine. He gave me the whole like tutorial of just like put up a post, make sure it's listed as podcast, and it will go up onto the feed. Great. All that stuff was fine. Just needed some hosts, and obviously the podcast started. Episode 1 is I believe episode 1 is just myself and Callum, and then Rich came on board relatively shortly after that. Then Kelly, and then stuff happened after that. Callum left, Rich left, like Troy came on board, Harrison came on board, Greg came on board, and stuff like that. I think there's a few other like guest appearances of like some people were on like one podcast initially and stuff like that. There's a few other members who were on like a podcast or two and so on. And again, that was one of those things where like, that's tough in terms of, it seems like a cool idea. Yeah, anyone can do a podcast. But it's very different when you actually get to actually doing it. There's a difference between being able to post well on a forum, because you can take as long as you want basically to write your response to a thread or whatever. Whereas in a podcast, because even if it is a recorded podcast like ours is, there's still a sense of like you don't want to completely ruin the flow of the recording by just, completely blanking when it's your turn to speak. So it is like a live to tape type thing where you don't want there to be a ton of editing going on. So, that's a little bit of a different experience. And so finding like the right people to be the regular host of the podcast, I suppose was something that took a little bit. And ultimately, like, I think all of the hosts were like great for the kind of periods of time that we had them. And obviously now it is just myself and Greg. And, it's one of those things like, it's always awkward to try and like bring someone new on, because you have to get across like, okay, we recorded a set time. This is like the technology basically we use in terms of like, we do it over Skype. I record the call, but audio wise, you have to have equipment up to a certain level. And like, if you don't meet all of those requirements, like you can't even be on the podcast. But then the big thing is that, okay, we get to actually do the recording and we go, what if someone just is not suited to the podcast? That sort of almost like messes up the whole recording session. I don't think that ever really happened. And a lot of that is because, the way we do the podcast obviously is that like I'm typically the set host and I bring everyone else in to talk. So that takes a lot of pressure off, and it made it a kind of fun thing where we did those sort of one-off episodes where I think it was when the podcast was... Yeah, I think it was when the podcast was me, Callum, Rich, Kelly. I think we did a run of 3 shows where Callum hosted one, Rich hosted one, Kelly hosted one. It obviously only happened once because I believe that the thing that happened there was just that they were all sort of like, okay, let's do this for a bit of fun. And then they're like, okay, you just host the rest of the podcast. Because it's a little bit more stressful being the main host, because you have to do sort of the most talking on the podcast. And then typically you have to be the one to plan it. And just doing stuff like the intro to the podcast, it is so like in my head, like this is the intro to the podcast. This is the intro to my YouTube video. Someone else suddenly having to do that for the first time, it is a list of quite a few things, because you have to be like, okay, you have to do the welcome, you have to include the name of the site, what episode number it is, you have to get that all right. You then have to introduce yourself as the main host and then bring in each of the other hosts in order, whatever order you decide, and then transition from the intro into the news and if you're not used to it, it is a kind of different whole way of doing things. So, yeah, in that sense, like other people coming on board when I'm the host is usually a pretty okay thing. But yeah, the podcast was always one of the main goals and things that I wanted to accomplish on the site. Like, even more than like the news posts that I put up and doing the reviews for the episodes and comics as they came out, the thing I was always most proud of with the site was the podcast. And, you know, I focused more on YouTube, I suppose, since sort of like 2014, 15, 16. But like, I've had my channel since before that. And I often think to myself, like, I think my channel would have like quite a lot more subscribers if I'd focused on YouTube over doing the podcast. But I also consider that if not for the podcast, I don't think I would be able to do the type of YouTube content that I do right now. And so it kind of had to work that way, because otherwise I don't think I probably would have ever had the confidence to actually do YouTube videos if not for the podcast and how that went down. So it's one of those things where like I almost feel like if I had focused on YouTube from like 2011, 2012, I probably would never have really gotten into doing like, you know, speaking on the channel. Because I think if you go back, like some of the earlier videos on my channel are news videos where it's just sort of like music over text and images, and it doesn't actually feature me talking or discussing the news. It's just presenting the news, which seems kind of like a crazy thing almost, considering the typical style of content I have for the site, and the podcast is very, you know, discussion detail orientated. And that really only came about because of the podcast. Yes, my posts on the site have always been that way. That's just the style of posting and analysis that I do. But having it be in audio was definitely a kind of pretty notable thing. So, yeah, I suppose I should discuss at this point Quora launching and, you know, being in a position where I was effectively running a fan site as a new hot show was coming out for the fandom. Book One was incredible. Book One was incredible. The site was so popular. The community was so excited for Book One. It was for me, the run of Quora Book One is the most exciting period in fandom that I've ever had, in my opinion. Just the sheer excitement watching those episodes, knowing sort of just how many people were watching the episodes at the same time. And especially with the fact that Book One is very mystery focused, with the whole bloodbending stuff once it comes into play. Who is Amon? What is Amon? All of those questions that came about, it created such a great dynamic in the fandom, as there was speculation, there was discussion. And look, there was obviously still some complaints back then about the fact that it isn't Avatar, but back in Book One, we were just so excited to have new Avatar that I don't think it turned into more of the debate between the shows until much later on in the run of the show. But for sure, the community, the site just grew and grew. Like with the podcast, because we had launched it before Quora, it actually ended up taking off relatively well. Even though we only had like maybe one or two podcasts before Quora actually launched, it still ended up doing quite well, which is always something that I'm kind of like happy about. A lot of that is because of the timing of things. Of like, you know, 2012 still feels like relatively modern, but it was 8 years ago. Podcasts were still like somewhat kind of new at the time, whereas now in 2020, like, it feels like, you know, everyone has a podcast almost. Anyone can do it. Back then it was still like a little bit more difficult to do, so we kind of stood out a little bit more. The problem definitely came in with after book one ended, because just look at the episode schedule from 112 to 201. There's like a 15-month gap where we didn't know what was happening for most of it. Obviously it got announced eventually, but we pretty much went the core of like 9 months to a year without really having a proper update on the show. And this is even accounting for the fact that we had Coronation back then, and they were actually using Coronation as their social media platform to put out news, which was really exciting during like Book One and when they finally got going on the book 2 hype train, it was actually a quite exciting thing. But I think it's fair to say, like, it felt like we lost half the fandom because of that gap. No one knew when the show was coming back, and so I noticed this with just regards to the members. The amount of members that we'd sort of built up over the course of book 1 versus the amount of members that were active as book 2 actually hit, it was night and day. And, you know, add into that a few sort of technical things that happened. If anyone's been a member of the site, you probably remember sort of spam/hacker attacks being kind of a little bit of a thing we had to deal with. Including one major thing that was actually like super serious, where the site was basically taken down. I can't remember the specifics of it exactly, but what ended up happening was that Jordan obviously runs more the technical side of things. The only way he was able to properly like kind of save/fix things was to basically revert the site to a backup, like I think it was like a few weeks before. And so we just kind of felt like we were just discussing this together, like, is this the end of the site? Because we've just lost like so much kind of progress basically with the site. How do we go about fixing this? And we just made the decision like, okay, no, we're not letting the site go out like this. And pretty much for like a whole day, the two of us just, from the backups that we were able to find of all the posts that were missing, we just reposted like all of the news articles and stuff like that. And like it took ages, it took hours and hours of doing it, but we eventually got all those posts back up. But again, that was another setback that we had because of, you know, basically people trying to hack the website. Similarly, just general spam stuff was always kind of a little bit of a problem, like fake accounts signing up and immediately posting all your sort of like spammy ad links and stuff like that, you know, I need to delete, the other moderators need to delete. That was never actually like that much of an issue. It was just a major annoyance in that most of what I was doing as a moderator was just deleting these posts from the feed. Because of the way the site worked, because it was more like a social media site, yes, it can work like a normal message board, but a lot of people did actually go off the main sort of community board, which basically listed the most recent activity in like all forums together. So if you just had spam people posting in any thread, it was just a bunch of links, and that took quite a while to deal with. And, you know, as we went into book, you know, from book 2 into book 3 and 4, obviously the waits between seasons were a lot easier to deal with. But the fandom became less and less, and the show then switched to being online rather than on TV. And I don't think that necessarily negatively impacted the fandom, but it definitely made the fandom feel very weird about how Nickelodeon viewed the show. But I think this also speaks to the transition that we saw, both in terms of how fandom is and exists online, as well as the new way that just everyone basically watches media. And obviously it's very difficult to look at what happened with Korra and view it as necessarily like Nickelodeon being ahead of the game. But in a way, that's kind of what happened. Korra being switched to being online ultimately did help the show to be more accessible to people. They gave at least a somewhat official way online for people to watch the episodes. Yes, if you weren't from America, you had to use like a VPN to watch some of those live streams of episodes. But it was to some degree Nickelodeon acknowledging the fact that this fandom is super online focused. We have to accommodate to them, not so much appointment television. And that's where like Avatar and Korra have both never really fit Nickelodeon. A large part of the reason they never air both of those shows on Nickelodeon is because they have to air them in order. You can't really air those shows out of order because they're so continuity heavy. So they've never kind of fit that style. So again, it was sort of the right thing to do almost, to just officially have the episodes go up online. And that was And then looking at that now from a 2020 perspective, who watches TV shows as they air on TV? I know for sure I don't. I know a lot of people don't. If a show isn't available online via a streaming service or whatever, it's like what are you doing? That's so old school almost to watch a show on TV, which is very different from the start of the fandom and it being sort of definitely on TV. But then we saw the start of, no, watch the show online. And then in Quora, we really saw the switch. And that's happened really, really heavily to everything you watch online. Because if they do ever announce a third Avatar series, can you picture yourself watching Nickelodeon on TV, on your like the TV channel Nickelodeon on TV? I can't. I know for a fact like it'll be some sort of an online thing, whether on a Nickelodeon website or whatever the Viacom streaming service is. That's just the way it's going to be. And while it looked terrible at the time, making the switch of the show in the middle of book 3 without really telling anyone what you were doing, it made book 4, when it actually happened, very easy to watch, very easy and accessible. And it's why, like, even back then, I always was saying the thing of, like, why are we talking so much about the TV ratings? Even back then, how many shows do you actually watch on TV? Why are we focusing so much on this weirdly calculated TV rating system that doesn't really accurately account for everything, or international fans? And I'm like, the online method is kind of better, because I'll always remember that when they put the finale for book 2 online as the premiere basically for those episodes, they came out and talked about the huge online numbers of viewers that they got. That was way more than anything Nickelodeon had ever seen. And I think this was right back at that time where we saw that transition to, streaming services, digital is the way that TV shows go. Which I think we then saw when most of the Avatar crew moved on to Voltron, and Voltron as a Netflix show was obviously done by releasing the seasons, full seasons at a time, on Netflix, not on TV, and that fit better for a similar style of fandom. The other transition that I think we saw, and it links into sort of more of the sort of the slow loss of popularity of, I suppose, Avatar: The Last Airbender Online, as well as other fan sites, is that fandom also greatly changed over the course of Quora as well, in my mind. That, message boards, forums specific to a specific franchise feel like a very much a thing of the 2000s, like, 2000 to 2010, and a little bit after that. Obviously, a lot of them are still active at this point, but nowadays you definitely would consider, when you talk about fandom, it to be more about, you go to the Reddit, the subreddit for your franchise. You have your own social media accounts on Twitter, Tumblr, whatever. YouTube as well. That's what fandom is, more so than, oh, I'll go to the specific Avatar fan site and discuss stuff there. Most people are like more than happy nowadays to just, on their social medias, talk about their fandoms. And I think that's another part of the big shift that we saw, of like, there's not really much of a need for specific fan sites anymore, because in a way they came from the perspective of, like, them sort of being the more sort of nerdy hobbies, and then you have to go to a very specific website out here into the message boards where the whole fandom is, to now, who has a problem with anyone being super into a TV show or something like that? No one. Just talk about it openly on social media. And that's why there is popular content on YouTube, social media, and stuff like that for all of these franchises, which is basically the shift that I had to go through, is that, like, realizing that I just can't put all of this time into this fan site when I know this is not the direction things are going. And so when, like, I suppose, 2015-ish, 2016 happened, a few years after Quora had ended, we realized that there's not enough people posting on the forums. Literally like a handful of posts a week if we're lucky. and it really being this place where only like a handful of the really hardcore members of the community are talking to each other, it wasn't worth keeping the forums up at that point, and so we just had to make the decision to shut it down, to focus on like the podcast and news a little bit more. And then even with the news and sort of review content on the site, me actually writing the posts, the thing that happened there was just that, like, again, why am I doing this when I can post it up on YouTube and sort of discuss it, and it just be a little bit easier for me to do? Plus, I can make money from my YouTube channel. I can't really doing that on the site, and just for myself, I had to make the decision to, like, it's not worth my time to put up the news articles there when, you know, everyone is ultimately going to post the news on social media, on Twitter, Tumblr, whatever. So why don't I just, you know, stick to, I'll post and discuss the news on YouTube. So you get an element of sort of the community stuff. And that's what I sort of try to make the content on YouTube like. That we're having a sort of almost like in-depth forum discussion, but more in a kind of YouTube sense. That's always been my thing, and what I try to make the case with the site of, like, that's what we want. We want in-depth discussion, but we also want it to be fun, and that's what I try to do on the site also. So that pretty much describes more or less the position that the site is in right now, where the site is still up. You can look at like all the posts basically from the history of the site, but the forums aren't up anymore. And the only recent posts are podcasts, and even that, I haven't really put up a lot of the recent posts on the site, because in the last year or two, the site has been very up and down with regards to when it is or isn't online. And again, it's not my site, so as much as I'm like an admin on the site and have access to a lot of the sort of behind the scenes features of it to put up posts and so on, I don't have access to like the hosting account for the site and how all that sort of stuff works. That is Jordan's area. So when the site is down for you, the site is also down for me. And the only thing I can really do is like email Jordan about it, and I don't like to kind of feel the need to, like, you know, always have to do that when the site goes down. So I kind of just made the decision of just like, I think the podcast is now also going to have to be sort of YouTube only for now, because I can't put the effort into making the podcast post up on the site and doing the file transfer and all that sort of stuff to get out of the feeds if the site's never going to be up. So again, it's just that unfortunate thing of just like, yes, the podcast has to be YouTube only for now, but that's just the way it is. And I do feel that, like, even if there was a third series announced, I don't necessarily know if it would be the best idea to try and sort of reignite the site again, from my perspective, because if a third series is announced, I'd use that more as an opportunity to really try and grow my YouTube channel here. And again, like, I'd still continue to do the podcast. To me, ultimately, the podcast I still feel is the ultimate, like, main accomplishment that I have from all the work I did on the site. That's the thing that was there from pretty close to the beginning of my being part of ATLAOnline, and it's still there. And that's why, like I said, that's why I still introduced the podcast by saying it is the podcast for the fan site Avatar The Last Airbender Online.com. That even though the site isn't really active anymore, and I don't post the news there or anything like that, this podcast still ultimately stems from that. And I think it's the same thing with Avatar Spirit, where they also shut down their forums. And I'm guessing it is mainly due to inactivity, because they probably did only have a few very regular members there who have probably been there since the start, and have been there like a long time, regular for a bunch of years. It's not worth it to keep a whole forum up when realistically you're getting a handful of posts a week, a handful of posts a month, and they're mainly only from about like 10 or so people. And most of the fandom is online. So they made a similar decision to the one I suppose we had to make, which was that, yeah, we're going to keep the site up, but ultimately the forums, it's too much effort, work for the lack of popularity that there is right now. And Avatar Spirit, of course, is a little bit different in the sense that they have a lot of sort of interviews that actually do contain sort of like canonical information. So it is important to some degree that those interviews are accessible online, and I think that is part of the reason why like they're still up, because like I don't believe they've posted like a news update on their site either in quite a while. And even then, over the last few years, when they still were posting news updates, it was only very scattered ones, more of the bigger ones, maybe like a new comic announcement. So, like, nowhere near, like, say, on my channel, where like I would pretty much discuss anything that is news that is Avatar related. They'd only post the big stuff, and I think that's just the situation we're in, where, and I think I can't really speak for them of like if there was a third series, would they relaunch their forums? I'm not sure, and I don't really know, especially with our side. Again, like I said, I don't know on the technical side of things as well how feasible it is to relaunch the forums for us either. If there was a third series, that would all be up to Jordan, like I said. I'd be there to, I suppose, help run it if it happened, but again, it's one of those things that's difficult to really speculate on right now. I do honestly feel like this probably isn't worth it for the forums when fandom, I think, just is online focused now. That Reddit pretty much serves most of the role that individual fan forums served, and there's no real need to sort of attempt to compete with it, because it is ultimately just, I suppose at this point, maybe it is splitting the community a little bit too much, when I think at this point where we're at is like, yeah, you know, you follow the YouTubers that you like, that do content about the shows that you like, follow them on social medias and stuff like that, the people who discuss the show and talk about it just as passionately as you do. That's more of the way things are. And I think that's just the way things have gone. And look, it is unfortunate. I often do think about it, and it's just like, yeah, it's kind of sad that the site just isn't really active, and that the community that was there isn't really around anymore. But it is fun still when every so often I see a name on YouTube that I remember first interacting with online from the site like 8 years ago. That's kind of exciting to me, and that's still sort of there. That I'm still doing Avatar content, and I'm still ultimately associated with Avatar: The Last Airbender Online.com. It's just I have very much, shifted my focus to, in those early years on the site, I put a lot of time and effort into the site in terms of working on community building and helping the forums to be as good as they are, organizing stuff like with the other moderators and so on. And now that time is more going into YouTube, which is just, again, the way things have gone. And it's one of those things like, yeah, I'll always remember the time on Avatar Online, because it's what I remember primarily as my experience in the fandom. Like I said, I don't have a ton of like individual specific moments from the Avatar fandom from the first show, because like I said, I was only on the internet post book 2, because we only had the internet after that, and most of the book 3 experience was very sort of all over the place, moving from site to site, trying to find the news, and never really having like a sort of home base in a way. Because like obviously that was like before social media was super popular, so forums were a thing, but I'd never found the forum I liked until Avatar: The Last Airbender Online. So yeah, that's most of what I want to talk about in this video. Like I said, the main things are that yeah, it's just that shift of I don't think there's as much value in the fan sites necessarily anymore, and also, like I said, with Korra, when it was airing, I think we saw that shift to appointment television, viewing things on TV, to no, streaming is the way to go. And if they ever did do a third show, it'll be very interesting to see how the direction goes on things. I think we probably have advanced past a lot of that stuff, and probably won't see a direct return to a lot of that. But that's just the situation. Like, you know, it's kind of interesting when you look at stuff like that, and it's like, wow, Avatar Spirit shutting down their forums. That's a kind of notable thing for the fandom. The same was when we shut down our forums and stuff like that. It's just what happens. But yeah, that's my thoughts on my, I suppose, history with the fans, the fandom, Avatar: The Last Airbender Online.com, and just the whole fandom at large, basically. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.